What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Bow Warden. So the Stamina Warden has kind of been a hot class for those of you guys who have always wanted to play a double bow build. While the double bow build is not necessarily quite as strong as your classical dual wield bow build, with changes that have been happening over the past few patches, it has definitely come to its own strength here. So while it does pull a little bit less than the dual wield bow build, it has become a lot more powerful since the Warden was released about a year and a half ago now, and it is actually very competitive with some ranged Magicka DPS specs now. So double bow Warden is definitely a class that, while I would not necessarily recommend you play as a stamina spec, it is definitely a perfectly viable option to clear pretty much any piece of content in the game right now. I have known a couple of people who have used bow builds to clear Asylum hard mode, to clear Cloud Rush hard mode, so it is definitely a much it's a pretty hard build to master, but if you can master it, it definitely opens up a lot of opportunities for you in terms of being able to play at ranged while using, stamina rather than a Magicka spec here. So just like the rest of our build videos, we'll be going over gear, skills, attributes, everything you need to know in order to recreate this build yourself. We will be going over a couple of gear substitutions that you might want to make depending on whether you have the DLCs or the expansions. We will talk a little bit about that when we go over our gear, but beyond that, we're just going to talk about the build. We'll go over our rotation a little bit. There has a little bit of a discussion about whether to use Subterranean Assault or Lethal Arrow, and I'll go over the pros and cons of each, and why I'm using Subterranean Assault on this particular build, and then we'll finish things off with the 6-man W part so you guys get an idea of where this build stacks up compared to other ranged builds out there. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started here first with our gear. So this is the gear that I recommend all bow builds pretty much run now. So Monster Helm, we have 2-piece Velidreth here, both are medium. So in terms of Monster Helms, you really only have 2 options when it comes to bow builds, because there's not that many stamina Monster Helm sets, stamina DPS Monster Helm sets that also deal damage at range. Velidreth is probably one of the best ones out there because the disease spores do fly out a pretty decent distance away. It's probably between 20 and 25 meters. I haven't really measured it out exactly, but if you're within that like 20 meter-ish range, Velidreth, the disease spores can hit whatever it is you're targeting now. Now there is obviously the fact that you kind of have to aim it a little bit. So one disease spore will always go directly in front of you in basically a straight line, and you have 2 others that sort of branch off at 60-degree angles or thereabouts, 45-degree angles. So you kind of have to aim it a little bit here, and Velidreth, unlike when you play at melee range, it's pretty much going to be very difficult for you to get 2 or more disease spores to hit a boss at the same time, unless you're talking about something like St. Ohms perhaps, where his hitbox is basically enormous. So Velidreth is one of the 2 Monster Helm sets you can use here. This does come from Cradle of Shadows, so you do need to have access to Shadows of the Hist DLC in order to use this, but the other Monster Helm set that you could use is not a DLC Monster Helm set. It is actually a base game set. It is Stormfist. You can get this from Tempest Island. The 1-piece adds stamina regen, which is actually pretty good because bow builds do have the weakness of having, typically speaking, higher drain per second compared to a dual wield bow build, and that's mainly because you will not be running an absorb stamina enchant. So having that extra regen from Stormfist is actually pretty nice to have. When you deal damage, you have 10% chance to create a Thunder Fist to crush the enemy, dealing X amount of shock damage every second for 3 seconds, and then a final X amount of physical damage when the fist closes. So this is pretty strong. As you can tell, you can pretty much practice at range. It's not that big of a deal if you're not within melee range and you have Stormfist. Now, the downside of running Stormfist is that the Thunder Fist that spawns pretty much stays where it spawns during that whole 3-second duration. So if the boss happens to move out of the Thunder Fist, then it won't be dealing any damage at all. So that's kind of the downside of running Stormfist. Velidreth kind of has that issue too, where you do have to aim the spores, so you have to kind of line up the boss with the spore itself, so that way you make sure the spore actually hits the boss. So there are weaknesses to running both of them. So it's really whichever one you happen to like more, or whichever one you happen to get first. Both of them are pretty strong overall. So the body set is, as you guys can imagine, Relequen. Relequen is the strongest set for stamina DPS, regardless of whether that's a bow build, a 2-hand bow build, or a dual wield bow build. This can be obtained from Cloud Rest, which you need Somerset expansion in order to get this. So I have the perfect version here. You can go with the imperfect version if you can't get the perfect version, so the difference there is that 1096 max stamina. Though the perfect version, you can only get this from clearing Vet Cloud Rest +1 or above. The normal version can be obtained from any other configuration thereof. So if you can't get a group to do Vet Cloud Rest +1 or above, then you can farm the normal set. The DPS difference between the two of them is pretty small. It's probably less than 1% because that max stamina is not really going to be affected by that many modifiers compared to like on a Magicka DPS, for example. So if you don't have access to the Somerset expansion, then you will not be able to run Relequen because it is a trial set, so you aren't able to buy this off of Guild Traders. So if you can't run Relequen, you have a couple of other options. So the first option that I want to mention that I don't have on hand is going to be Hunding's Rage. This is a very classic set. It's a base game set. It's a crafted set. Very easy to obtain. So you need to know 6 traits in order to craft it yourself. If you can't craft it yourself, you can normally find somebody else in like a big trading guild to craft it for you for a small fee, or you can just buy pieces off Guild Traders too. It's a fairly cheap set to obtain because again it is a pretty easy set to craft. It's a base game set, so it's pretty easy to come by. So you do want that on the body piece because the 5-piece is 299 flat weapon damage, so it will not carry over to your back bar. So you just want to make sure that Hunding's Rage is on your body at all times. Other sets that you might want to consider running on the body if you don't have access to Relequen is going to be, let's see if I took it out of this box. Looks like I did. It's going to be Leviathan. Let me see if I can find it here. So here it is, Leviathan. It's a medium armor set that you can get from Crypt of Hearts. So this is a base game set. You can go Crypt of Hearts 1 or Crypt of Hearts 2. Crypt of Hearts 1 is obviously going to be a little bit easier than Crypt of Hearts 2. So this is basically like the stamina version of Mother Sorrow. So it just gives you a lot of weapon crit. So very similar to Hunding's Rage. Make sure you have this on the body because that 5-piece is a flat static bonus, so it will not carry over to your back bar if you have this as a front bar set. Another set option that you might want to consider running is going to be, I don't believe I have it here. It's going to be Briarheart. So Briarheart is a medium armor set that is dropped from Hrothgar. So if you want to farm it, you need to have the Hrothgar DLC. However, because it is a drop set, you can actually buy this off of Guild Traders. So you want to wear this on the body. You can wear this on the front bar if you would like, but there are other sets that you could run on the front bar instead of Briarheart here. But Briarheart's definitely a very good set. Unlike Hunding's Rage and Leviathan, this is a proc set. So if it happens to proc and you swap to your back bar, you still maintain that weapon damage bonus. So Briarheart will pull out a little bit ahead of Hunding's Rage, even though if you take into consideration uptime, the average weapon damage actually ends up being about equal to Hunding's Rage. And that's just because it does carry over to your back bar as a proc set. Plus, it also does give you a pretty nice heal whenever you do a critical hit, so that's always nice to have some additional survivability by running Briarheart here. So those are kind of your options for body sets, and again, Briarheart can be run as a front bar set as well. But the best front bar set that I found is going to be Tzogvin's Warband. So this is a medium armor set that comes from Frostvault, so you do need to have access to the latest Wrathstone dungeon DLC in order to farm this yourself. So this is going to be a front bar set. Now this is a medium armor set, so you can wear the body pieces instead if you happen to have jewelry pieces in your other set as well. So don't feel like you have to run 3 Tzogvin's jewelry like I have here. You can run Tzogvin's bodies as well. Just remember that your other set, we will have to run jewelry instead. So for example, for Relequen, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to run that on the jewelry just because jewelry only dropped from Vet Cloud Rest +2 or +3. And again, we're doing double bow build. Both bows are going to be infused. We have the Maelstrom Bow on the back bar with a weapon damage enchant, and then the Tzogvin's Bow on the front bar with a poison damage enchant. Our jewelry or weapon damage enchants across all 3, and then we have Bloodthirsty on all 3 jewelry pieces. Now, if you don't want to run Bloodthirsty, you can go with Infused instead. That's perfectly fine as well. Just remember that in order to transmute jewelry, you will need to have access to the Somerset expansion, as well as know these traits yourself in order to transmute them. So if you don't have access to Somerset, you can't transmute your jewelry pieces. So you will have to stick with Robust, unfortunately. But any combination of Bloodthirsty and Infused is going to give you good DPS overall. Now, the Bear ultimate for Stamina Wardens is not affected by Bloodthirsty still. It is a long-lasting, very well-known bug at this point. We don't know if it's going to be fixed or when it's going to be fixed. So if you want, you can run something like 2 Bloodthirsty, 1 Infused, or 2 Infused, 1 Bloodthirsty. So that way you're kind of making the most out of the Bear DPS, because the Bear will scale off of the Infused weapon damage glyph that you have on your jewelry pieces. Then for our armor, all divines, all stamina enchants. We are going 7 medium here, but you can swap a small piece, typically going to be one of your monster helm sets, for a heavy armor piece if you want some additional survivability with the additional health as well. Now, if you don't have access to Tzogvins, I mentioned earlier you can run Briarheart as a front bar set, and that's probably going to be one of your best alternatives for a set here. You could also run the Master's Bow on the front bar, and then run your second set as on your helm and shoulders, basically giving up your monster helm set for the Master's Bow. I found that actually pulled lower DPS compared to using a monster helm set, but that is an option if you want. Master's Bow is a base game set, so if you can run something like Hunding's Rage and Briarheart if you don't have any access to any of the DLCs, for example, so that way you're able to run the Master's Bow. You can run it on the back bar as well if you don't have access to the Redguard DLC to get the Maelstrom Bow, so you can run the Master's Bow on the back bar instead of running the Maelstrom Bow as well. So that's options for you guys there in terms of gear. Now going over our character sheet, in terms of races, it's pretty much unchanged compared to your typical stamina Warden build, dual wield bow build. So Orcs, Dunmer are going to be your top 2 classes because they have the highest mech stam bonus along with the 258 weapon damage. Following behind them are going to be the Khajiits with their 10% additional crit damage, as well as some additional mech stam. Not quite as much, it's only 825, but they also get some stamina regen as well. They get 85 additional stamina regen. And then you have the Redguards and the Bosmer. The Bosmer are going to have a lot better sustain than the Redguards in my testing. The Redguards, the Adrenaline Rush passive now proc with direct damage, so you are able to get some stamina back when you are using a bow build. But the Bosmer 258 additional stamina regen, typically speaking, will scale better compared to the Redguards Adrenaline Rush passive there. Now we are mainly using class abilities for a spammable, so you won't really see that much of a reduction in terms of stamina costs in your abilities by running a Redguard. So Bosmers do have a little bit better regen than Redguards when it comes to stamina recovery. In terms of attribute points, all 64 points are going into stamina here. You can put a few points into health if you want some additional survivability. I personally would not put more than 10 points into health, because at that point you're kind of giving up a little bit too much damage. For our Mundus stone, we're going with the Lover here. This is mainly because Sharpened is not going to be quite as strong on the front bar compared to Infused, so we are running Infused on the front bar, so we do need to make up the penetration, so we are running the Lover instead. Now you could potentially go with the Shadow if you would like, with a Sharpened front bar and just dump more points into piercing, but I found that running the Lover with an Infused front bar it gives me, at the very least, a little bit more consistent DPS. The DPS difference between running the Lover and an Infused front bar versus something like a Sharpened front bar with Shadow and dumping points into piercing, I found the DPS difference to be pretty small overall, so you can really go with whatever combination you'd like here. Then for food, and for purposes of the parse that we're doing at the end of the video, I am using Lava Foot, Soup, and Saltrus, so this basically imitates having blue food with orb support, so that's why I'm using Lava Foot. In an actual raid, you would be running something like Dubious Camoran Throne or Arteaum Takeaway Broth for the health, stamina, and the stamina regen. Like I mentioned a little bit earlier, bow builds do have the weakness of having higher drain per second compared to like a dual wield bow build, so you will need to have that Dubious Camoran Throne additional regen in order to kind of make up for that additional drain that you have there. So as long as you have Dubious Camoran Throne or Arteaum Takeaway Broth as well as orbs on cooldown, you should be able to sustain a light attack rotation for a good amount of the fight. You might need to do heavy attacks here and there, and I'll go over that when I talk about the rotation. Now for our skills, starting off with our front bar here, we have Cutting Dive, Subterranean Assault, Acid Spray, Bull Netch, Bird of Prey, and Wild Guardian. Then on our back bar we have Razor Caltrops, Poison Injection, Endless Hail, Bull Netch again, and Bird of Prey again, and then we have Wild Guardian. So Bird of Prey is here for that minor berserk that we get while we're slotted, and then Bull Netch on both bars is just for the additional damage done that we get from the advanced species passives. You can reasonably replace this with a Fighter's Guild passive, but I found that having a Animal Companion's passive did just a little bit more DPS compared to running a Fighter's Guild ability there. Now, there are some cases where you might want to run the Fighter's Guild ability. So, for example, Silver Leash is actually a pretty nice skill to have on hand. You probably won't use it all too much, but it is a nice pull to help out your tank with pulling in adds and things like that. So, just something you might want to consider picking up, but not necessarily using on the back bar. Like I said, though, you can run this on the back bar like so. I just found that having the Animal's Companion's passive is a little bit more DPS overall. I'll go over our champion points. So the CP cap has not changed between Murkmire and Wrathstone. So the CP cap is still 810, which gives us 270 points to put across each of our different constellation colors. So starting off with our green CPs, I have 75 in the moon cap, 75 in tenacity. That gives me 120 points to put into the remaining nodes, really however I'd like. So I have 40 Shadow Ward, 40 Tumbling, and 40 Warlord. Now you can bump moon cap and tenacity up to 100 to get that last 1% if you so desire. That will leave you with 70 points instead of 120 points to play around with on the rest of your green CP trees. Now for our blue CPs, I do want to make note here that I have fewer points in the piercing just because Tzogvin's does have physical penetration as part of its 4-piece bonus. So I don't need as many points in the piercing. Now if you're running something like Briarheart, you will need to put a couple more points in the piercing, and I'll show you that setup there, as well as the setup that I would run if you're going with a sharpened front bar with the Shadow Mundus instead. So if you're using Tzogvin's, you have with the lever, you have 64 mighty, 13 piercing, 66 precise strikes, 66 thaumaturge, and 61 into master at arms. Now if you are running Briarheart but you're still running the lever as your Mundus, you would basically be dropping bumping piercing up to 28, drop precise strikes down to 56, and thaumaturge down to 61. And now if you have sharpened as your front bar and you have your Shadow Mundus instead, you would drop 56 to master at arms, thaumaturge, and precise strikes. Might as well drop mighty down to 56 as well. You don't have to do this necessarily, and then bump piercing up to 46 instead here. You don't need to bump piercing down to 56 at all. You can actually keep it at 64 if you'd like. This should be enough to kind of make up the difference that you don't have with the Lover Mundus, but the safer bet, just because obviously debuff uptime is not going to be 100%, would be to drop mighty down to 56 and then just bump piercing up to 46 instead there. Now for our red CPs, this particular configuration I have is kind of a very balanced approach. So it'll give you very good mitigation basically across all pieces of content that you might want to run, but it will not maximize mitigation for any single piece of content. So for example, in Maw of Lorcage, you're going to want to spec more into mitigation for spell damage. So this would not be the best mitigation formula for Maw of Lorcage, but for just kind of general everyday use, this is going to be a very good setup here. We have 81 Ironclad, 61 Thick-Skinned, and 64 into Hardy and Elemental Defender. Alright, that's pretty much it for all of our build information, so now let's go ahead and go over our rotation itself. So the rotation is very similar to the typical Stamina Warden, is going to center around getting Shulks off. So Shulks, you can think of it as a 3-second dot. So basically you have time, when taking into consideration global cooldown is 1 second, you can do Subterranean Assault, you can do 2 active abilities, and then you can do Subterranean Assault again. So your rotation, again, very similar to Stamina Warden, is going to be centered around maintaining your Subterranean Assault uptime. So it's going to be Subterranean Assault, 2 abilities, Subterranean Assault, 2 abilities, and so on and so forth here. The main things you want to maintain are going to be your backbar dots as well as Bull Netch. For the sustain you get from the Bull Netch, and then your backbar dots are going to be the strongest dots that you have available to you. Acid Spray can let that kind of die down a little bit. You don't necessarily need to maintain 100% uptime on it, but if you can, certainly go for it. Now, to kind of address the sustain issue with bow builds. So I've mentioned this, I think, a few times in this video right now, but bow builds do have a lower regen, or I should say they have higher drain per second compared to your typical dual wield bow build. So you will need to do heavy attack here and there in order to fully sustain a rotation. So what I like to do is basically every time I am on my front bar, I do 1 heavy attack. So I'll show you guys this when I kind of demonstrate the rotation a little bit, but basically every time I'm on my front bar, I try to do 1 heavy attack, and that usually allows me to sustain a 6 million dummy parse here. So your general rotation is going to look something like this. So you're going to start off on your back bar. Well, we do have Tzogvins going, so you don't need to worry about running channel acceleration or anything like that. If you're running something like Briarheart instead, so you don't have that minor force, so Tzogvin does give you minor force when it is fully active here, but Briarheart obviously does not provide minor force for you. So if you are running minor force, you will need to pre-buff with channel acceleration here. So this would basically take the spot of Bull Netch on the back bar here if you're running Briarheart. Otherwise, you would have Bull Netch on the back bar here, and you just have minor force from Tzogvin's itself. So just start off with your back bar dots, make sure your Bull Netch is up before you start any pull. So again, you just want to do 2 active abilities between each cast of Subterranean Assault, and that does also mean you will have to break your back rotation like so. So I do a heavy attack. So when you want to do a heavy attack with, when you want to take consideration, I'm just messing up the rotation right now. But when you want to do your heavy attack, you do one active ability, then you do your heavy attack right into Subterranean Assault like so. So you would do one active, you do your heavy attack, then you go right back into your rotation there. And remember, it's 2 active abilities between every Subterranean Assault cast. That's basically the kind of general idea of the rotation itself. So again, when you want to do that heavy attack, I try to do it once every time I'm on my front bar. So I apply my back bar dots, I'm on my front bar, doing my front bar dots. I should say, do my front bar rotation. I try to do at least one heavy attack every time on my front bar just to help me maintain my full rotation there. So that's kind of the general idea of the rotation. You do need to stay within 20 meters in order to use this rotation. Subterranean Assault has a 20 meter kind of distance here. So just to kind of give you an idea of where 20 meters kind of stands, we're going to be using the Robust Centurion as a kind of measurement stick, so to speak, so you guys can get an idea of what 20 meters looks like. But at this point here, I'm still able to hit the skeleton. It's just barely able to hit it. So if I back up just a little bit more here, take a look at the health. I'm still able to hit it a bit more. So at this point, all the way back here, I'm not able to hit the Centurion at all. So you do need to be kind of within, right around here-ish is kind of a good visual guide to kind of 20 meters or so. Another good way to kind of measure this out is Acid Spray also has a 20 meter distance. So all the way back here, I'm not able to hit it with Acid Spray, which means I will not be able to hit it with Subterranean Assault. So you can also use Acid Spray to kind of judge where your distance is. And if I inch up a little bit more, now I'm able to hit the dummy that way. So this is kind of basically the maximum that you're able to go all the way out. And as you can see here, Velidreth does hit at that 20 meter kind of distance there. Okay, so we're going to reset the dummies. We're going to resummon our barrel, and we're going to do a 6-man dummy parse, so you guys can get an idea of where this build stands compared to other ranged builds. So I do want to make note here that you're going to want to take this DPS comparison and compare it to other ranged builds. So Bobo builds are kind of weird in that you can't really compare them to melee builds necessarily because you're not taking that melee spot, but at the same time you can't really compare them to Magicka DPS builds because Magicka DPS have different sort of builds, they have different debuffs and buffs that you kind of want to keep track of and things like that. So they're in this weird sort of middle ground here. So my best recommendation would be to take a look at it from a ranged perspective. So if you're trying to try out for any guilds that might have like stamina cutoffs or Magicka cutoffs, I would probably say your cutoff for a Bobo build will probably be somewhere in the middle because you do have access to sort of the stam abilities like Endless Hail, Caltrops, Poison Injection, which are all very strong. But at the same time, you're playing at range, so you don't necessarily need to compete with any sort of the melee spots there. So you're kind of falling somewhere in the middle there. You're this weird hybridization between like a melee DPS and a Magicka DPS. So you can take this at its face value, but it's very hard to kind of say compare this to range builds like Magicka builds because you also have to take consideration you kind of have access to stamina abilities as well. So just something you want to keep in mind when you want to compare this parse to other parses out there. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started here. One thing I will mention also is that Wardens do have access to Minor Berserk and Major Fracture. So we'll do a heavy attack here. Doesn't really matter where you put in your heavy attack as long as you do it at some point in your front bar rotation. One other set, oh I forgot to mention this, but you can also use War Machine as a front bar or body set if you would like. The War Machine is a medium armor set that you can get from Hulk's Fabrication. Basically provides Major Slayer whenever you use an ultimate. to you as well as to closest people to you. So it's very useful to have this as a kind of group utility set. It's not going to be as strong as Tzogvin's, but it does provide some pretty nice utility overall. So I do recommend at least picking up a set of War Machine. Do a heavy attack here. Alright, so there we go. That is DPS you can expect to see from a Bobo Warden. So we pulled about 49.38k, so pretty decent overall. I have had several higher parses with a couple of different variations here. Let's see here, I did have a 51.3k parse, a little bit higher penetration, so that might account for the little bit higher parse. But I also had a 50.2k parse with the lower penetration. This is pretty much identical, more or less identical to what I was running just now, so you can expect to see somewhere around that sort of 49 to 50k solo self-buff parse. Again, you do have access to Minor Berserk as well as Major Fracture from Subterranean Assault, so that's just something you want to keep in mind here. So Endless Hill, Relequen, Subterranean Assault, very strong. Caltrops as well. Acid Spray actually should deal a little bit more DPS. On average, you should be seeing around, if you combine the two, it should be sitting around 25 to 2600 DPS or so. So that is something you just want to take into consideration here. The big thing here, I think, that made our parts a little bit low was the fact that we didn't have very good crit RNGs. You can see here that our average crit was at 53.2 versus 65.4 was our mean weapon crit. You do have to take into consideration that Velidreth and Relequen don't proc, so that's something you want to keep in mind there. So that is pretty much it for this build video. If you guys have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. Hope you guys found this video informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.